All right, hello everyone. So today we're going to be talking about informed consent, and we're going to be talking a little bit about sort of the various definitions of informed consent that are out there and responding to various challenges, right? So first, broadly, what is informed consent? At this point, we've talked a little bit about it, but let's just try to kind of capture the essence of it. It is the medical, legal, and moral practice of informing research participants or subjects and patients of the risks of various research studies and or medical procedures like surgeries and stuff. So if I'm about to have a surgery, or I'm in need of a surgery, and say there are several options of different surgeries that I could do that all have sort of the same outcome, the physician is going to try and illustrate to me how each procedure works and tell me about the risks involved, right? Or the duration of time that it'll take for me to recover, these sorts of things. So um, so the idea is that you inform patients and research subjects of the risks, and they consent to the procedure in advance. And if a and so informed consent is not present, say, if somebody is ill-informed or they don't understand the risks and they consent, or if they do understand the risks and then withhold consent. So two things need to occur in order to have informed consent: the information and the actual consent. And so this is a practice that has kind of gotten a legal foothold in the 1970s and like 80s, right? And it is actually widely practiced today. Um, and this kind of whole discussion is premised on the claim that individual persons have a right to understand and to consent to the risks that follow from, research studies or various procedures. So it seems like we're doing something wrong if we say non-consensually force somebody to undergo a procedure, right? Or to say force somebody to be in a research study to which they don't consent. So informed consent as a concept has a lot of intuitive pull. Okay, so what exactly does informed consent mean? The author of this article, Beauchamp, gives us two different analyses of informed consent. So the first one is informed consent as autonomous authorization. According to this definition or this analysis, a person gives informed consent if and only if the person with a substantial understanding and in substantial absence of control by others intentionally authorizes a healthcare professional to do some procedure or to do something to them. So the idea here is once I understand the risks associated with a study or with a number of different medical procedures, I then autonomously, independently of anybody else's coercion, choose to undergo that procedure, right? So informed consent is essentially an autonomous or self-determining choice, right? It's focused on the individual, right? Being free from coercion and having some level of understanding of the risks involved with the procedures or with the study. Okay, so I think that this is kind of the intuitive understanding of informed consent, but there are competing conceptions as well. On the one hand, we have autonomous authorization, and then on the other, we have informed consent as institutional and policy rules of consent. So under this analysis, informed consent refers only to a legally or institutionally effective approval given by a patient or subject. An approval is therefore valid or effective if it conforms to the rules that govern a specific institution, right? The idea here is that informed consent is whatever the law says it is. right? Or whatever the institution in question says it is. So if informed consent merely involves sort of a contract in which you sign, if you sign it, that's informed consent, right? Even if, say, you don't understand the risks substantially, or even if, say, you're coerced, your signature on a piece of paper, for example, just counts as informed consent. And so this view, institutional and policy rules of consent, this view is informed consent is relativized to the laws and jurisdictions of the patient or subject, right? So if I'm going to have a procedure in, say, Tennessee, I'm subject to Tennessee laws. If I'm going to have a procedure in Canada, I'm subject to whatever Canada says informed consent is. If I'm going to have a procedure in New York, I'm subject to whatever New York state law says informed consent is. So informed consent is merely whatever the law says, and it can vary depending on where you are. So our author, Beauchamp, prefers informed consent as autonomous authorization, right? So essentially what the law is trying to capture, according to Beauchamp, is consent as autonomous authorization, not necessarily as consent as institutional and policy rules of consent, right? Okay. Nevertheless, we run into problems. So the first problem is that the law has limits. And so we'll say that problem one primarily sort of comes from the second understanding of informed consent. So informed consent, at least in like US law, is essentially a legal concept that involves fully disclosing the risks involved and the liability for injury, right? But the thing is that these two things are actually quite limited in scope, right? So we might wonder about, okay, there might be more at issue here than just disclosure and liability for injury, right? These things sort of fail to give us a full moral picture. So for instance, we might wonder, well, does it matter how the consent is obtained? We might wonder about instances where somebody wants to waive consent, right? Or perhaps somebody has another person stand in to consent on their behalf. It seems like all of these fringe issues sort of are fallen out of the legal scope of informed consent. So for instance, in the show Better Call Saul, Saul is in a lawsuit against a nursing care facility, right? And he's trying to solicit people who are at various franchises of this nursing facility. He's trying to get them to join the lawsuit against the nursing care facility, right? And the way he obtains consent from these people who are in the nursing care facilities is by like trying to super persuade them, right? Showing off, doing this big show and telling them how much money they're going to get, right? And that kind of persuasion in order to obtain somebody's consent is like a problem. So we might wonder if we have a doctor that's trying to sell somebody a procedure, that's going to be a problem. So we may not want to call that an instance of informed consent because they were persuaded by somebody with, say, an interest. So it seems like, at least as far as the law goes, informed consent's scope needs to be broader than just disclosure and liability for injury. Okay. There's a second problem too. The second problem is a little bit more philosophical. So we might wonder how demanding informed consent needs to be, and whether we can meet such a demanding standard. So for instance, If informed consent involves understanding on part of the subject or the patient, then it can be difficult to convey the information in an accessible way, right? Um, so the idea here is once I understand the risks, only then am I in a place to consent, right? But it can be really hard to get people to understand what exactly is going on. And it can be hard to convey just how much information is necessary for that understanding, right? So basically, if you're talking to somebody who just doesn't get it, right, then when they do consent, it's actually not informed consent because they don't actually really understand what's going on. That's kind of the problem here. So we might, okay, in response to this is my response, um, and not Beauchamp's. So in response, we might say that, or we might question, like, why is understanding necessary for informed consent? So let's do a little bit of thinking about what understanding is. So in epistemology, and this is a branch of philosophy that we're not talking about in this class, but epistemology involves trying to understand what knowledge is. And so a lot of people also try to understand what understanding is, right? They want to give various definitions for what we mean by understanding and what we mean by knowledge. And it seems like if we're going, okay, so in epistemology, people want to say that understanding is actually pretty hard to obtain. When you understand something, you don't only know that it's true, but rather you can explain why it's the case. You can explain sort of how it comes to be. You can you're in an epistemic position to explain why exactly everything is going on, right? Um, Knowledge, however, merely involves believing truly that something is the case with some evidence without necessarily being able to explain the full picture, right? Okay, so we have understanding on the one hand, which is harder to achieve. Then we have knowledge on the other hand, which is relatively easy to achieve, right? So rather, instead of understanding, perhaps mere knowledge is necessary, or perhaps is sufficient for an informed consent, right? Um, the idea here is that, look, it's easier to know things than it is to understand things. And so maybe all we need is to, on the basis of the surgeon's testimony, know these are the relevant outcomes. Even though I don't really know why they're the relevant outcomes, I know that they are the relevant outcomes. And if I'm thinking through two procedures and the physician says procedure A is riskier than procedure B, well, it seems like I now know, well, procedure A is riskier than procedure B. I don't really know why one is riskier than the other. So I'm going to opt for procedure B, even though I don't really understand what makes one procedure riskier than another, right? So if this is right, and we can have informed consent merely on the basis of knowledge, right? Well, then it seems like we can kind of sidestep this problem, right? Because it can be at least relatively easier to convey the risks when we don't have to expect someone to understand the risks. So anyway, this is my attempt to kind of engage with the piece here. Maybe this is a good response, maybe it's not. I'd love to know what you think. But thank you for listening to this lecture.